Good evening, everyone. We are now starting the discussion. I'm going to speak a little bit about how we understand grief and loss, and a little bit about how the specifics of CJD, the experience of CJD, the way that the losses of CJD would be specific to this experience. Okay. This is a quote from actually one of my patients. I run a private practice here in the city working with people who are dealing with grief. And one of my patients said this to me a year or two ago, and it really struck with me. I'm not sure if she made this up or if this is something people know. But she said, you know, everybody dies in the middle of someone else's story. And it really struck me. And one of the reasons I like to share it is it's an acknowledgement that, you know, that somebody else's death and somebody else's experience of illness is happening in the middle of our story, right? That our story has a before and our story has an after, and a recognition that there's always going to be an after, right? And just, to me, this felt like just very meaningful as we're thinking about how we understand grief. You know, tonight when I'm speaking about grief, I'm speaking about it in two ways, right? One are all the losses that we experience from the moment that your world changes, right? And your after may have started with a symptom. It may have started with a crisis. It may have started with a doctor's appointment, but the point at which you realize that something had changed, nothing was going to be the same again. And that is the moment when your grief starts. And this is true for people with all illnesses, but especially when you have an illness that is so difficult to diagnose, and when the certainty of mortality is known from the very beginning, right? The grief starts right away because already you're in the after, right? Already your life is not going to be the same. And so when we think about what is it like to have somebody die in the middle of our story, it's also a recognition that the losses started in the middle of their story as well. And so I'm just going to sort of briefly, one of the things that I find helpful with grief is that, you know, it's sort of, there's grief that we can easily recognize. Like if somebody dies, we know when somebody dies, there's a day that they died, right? There's a day they were alive and a day they were dead. And after somebody dies, there's some social acknowledgement. Like, oh, this person died on a Tuesday. Let me bring you a casserole. Let's have a ritual. Let's have a service. And there's some social acknowledgement. And around the holidays, so there's some acknowledgement. Oh, yes, you know, this is your first holiday without such and such. And the next year, this is your first year, 1 year anniversary. And those losses, you know, we have some social support to figure out how to grieve. The losses that are more tricky are the losses that are less clear, right? Because sometimes we can't even name them for ourselves. So one of the things I want to do here is sort of a very brief grief 101 of different ways that we experience loss. And this is not to add a long list of reasons why you should be bummed out, but to hopefully hold space to recognize the enormity of what you've probably already been adjusting to and what you've already been reckoning with for a long time. And in doing so, my hope is that there's room for more compassion and more gentleness and more healing. So this is sort of a very brief way to understand different losses, and then we're going to go into CJD losses specifically. So losses can be ambiguous or concrete, right? For anybody who's been a caregiver for somebody with CJD, you know that the losses begin long before somebody dies, right? There's the loss of the person as you recognize them, the loss of control over your life and your schedule, the future you thought you were going to have, right? There's all these losses that happen before somebody dies. And so we can think of losses as ambiguous or concrete. And a concrete loss is one where it is sort of objectively clear what you lost and when you lost it, right? Like a death. And an ambiguous loss is where you lose part of something, or it is unclear when you lost it, when the person is physically present, but psychologically and sort of existentially and personality-wise, not the person you know or you recognize, right? That's an ambiguous loss. They're both here and they're not here. I'm holding on and letting go all at the same time. And it's hard sometimes to recognize that this is such a major loss and this is such an important loss because, first of all, you're very busy with caregiving and all the logistics of day-to-day and adjusting to all the new things. There's a shock of this information and such the rapidity of such decline. And there's the fact that it's really hard. It's hard to recognize the different things that we've lost. But just to recognize that some of the things we lose in bits and pieces when we're already overwhelmed, and some of the things we lose in a fell swoop all at once, right? And these are different ways that we can sort of experience losses. The other ways we can understand what we lost are things that are physical and things that are symbolic, right? We can lose a person, we can lose a leg, we can lose a home. We can lose a relationship, we can lose a role, we can lose a future, right? Those are more symbolic losses. And again, the physical losses are sometimes easier to name and grieve, but the symbolic losses tend to be very, very painful as well, right? Partly because they're often not named, and partly because it feels like, what did I really lose? But a lot of times these losses of roles and functions and relationships, a loss of a shared history of somebody who knows what you went through and has a sense of your relationship together and a sense of the future you would have had, these symbolic losses are part of the grieving process. We can also understand grief along a temporal line. So grief can be anticipatory, pre-death, and post-death for this purpose. Anticipatory grief, we think of as grief that we are experiencing now for things we anticipate losing later. So now I am grieving for the future we will not have, right? Now I am grieving for this event that I will not get to go to, for this life I will not get to live with this person, right? For the time in which this person will no longer recognize me. Pre-death losses are losses that happen anytime before somebody dies, right? And those are a lot of the ambiguous losses that we were speaking about. And post-death losses are losses that happen after people die. The important thing with anticipatory grief is to recognize that even though you're anticipating losses later, what will it be like when this person becomes, has declined more, what happens when this person dies, is that the grief is happening now, even if you're anticipating the loss later. And you need to hold and love and care for your grief, however it is that you do that, as it is happening now, even if the event has not happened, because once it is in your sphere, it is real, and your nervous system and your body and your heart are responding to the loss. Because once it becomes a real possibility, then the grief has already begun. So don't, I guess, tie your ability to validate your grief to whether or not the event has happened yet. But recognize that if you were having a reaction before, the grief has begun now. And the last sort of category with which we're going to understand grief are disenfranchised and acknowledged losses. Acknowledged losses are ones where other people can see and give support and acknowledge. And I think I gave the example, if somebody dies, you sort of know your community may come together. Whatever your community's version of bringing a casserole by will be the bringing a casserole, acknowledging holidays, acknowledging the first without, and all those different things. The disenfranchised ones are the ones that people don't necessarily acknowledge, right? That might be the last time there was spontaneous intimacy, right? Other people don't necessarily know when that happened, but for you, that is a loss that may be experienced. You may not even know when it happened, right? When somebody dies, you may feel the loss of caregiving. And other people around you may say, how can you be sad not to be caregiving? That was such a brutal time, right? It broke your heart. And for some people, the experience of caregiving was the last act of love that they remember with the person, right? And so that loss is sometimes, there's not necessarily space held for it all the time. However well-intentioned, hopefully all of you are surrounded by lovely, well-intentioned people, but even well-intentioned people may not recognize the depth of what that loss means to you. And so we can think of losses here, both in terms of the nature of the loss, the time of the loss, and what the loss means to us and what the loss means to the communities around us. And when we start to sort of form this idea, and it's not so important to diagnose your losses and say, are you in this category or that one, but just to start to look for the places where things might be tender inside and start to look for the places where you may be, where the losses may be still quite painful and quite raw in places you may not have expected, right? So throughout this, I want to give you opportunities to check in with yourself. And these are questions you can ask yourself now, you can ask yourself later. But I want to make sure we go between your sort of your head, where you're thinking about things and checking in with how you're feeling. Throughout your grief process, I would encourage you to ask yourself, how do I feel about my grief? Am I mad that I'm grieving all the time? Am I worried that I'm grieving all the time? Does this feel like an act of love to be grieving all the time? How do I feel about my grief? Like not just in my grief, but how do I feel about my grief? What is my relationship to my grief, right? Do I have the ability to hold my grief as lovingly as I hold the people in my life who are important to me? And also asking yourself, how do I feel right now? In this moment, if I take a moment and check inside and scan my body and look inside and notice what's happening inside, what do I notice? Are there little pockets of sadness and fear?
I can move into the bedroom.
Oh, no, that's fine. I'll go somewhere else. So
Are there pockets of, is there somebody able to mute that? Okay. Are there pockets of sadness and fear? Or is there anger? Is there numbness, right? Are there different things that are happening for folks? And so taking the time to recognize, how do I feel about my grief and how do I feel right now, I think can be really useful sort of reflective questions as we go through. One of the things I'm going to do, and this is what happens when you have, you're getting Professor Abby for a minute, not Therapist Abby. I'm going to give you two models, two paradigms. And these are more academic, right? These aren't ones that most people are sort of taking in their daily lives, but I think that these are really useful ways to frame your experiences, right? Because I'm talking to you for about 45 minutes or whatever it is, but you're living with your grief all day, every day. And I want you to have a way to sort of organize your experience. So when it's late at night and you're alone and you're overwhelmed, or you're sitting at a table where everyone else is laughing and you're feeling something different inside, and you have a way to understand, where am I right now? What's going on? Like, I want to have that sort of bridge. So I'm going to give you two different models by which you can understand your grief and how you're coping. The window of tolerance is actually a trauma model, but I think it's so helpful for caregivers, especially both present and former. So the dual process model of grief, a lot of times when people think about grief, they think about the stages, the 5 stages of grief, which was a brilliant anthropological contribution to our conversations about loss. But it's not meant to be a list of stages that you check off on a worksheet to make sure you're going through grief. We think about grief as going as an oscillation. It's a movement between 2 parts, where we have parts, sometimes we're in this loss orientation, which is, what did I lose? And what did it mean that I lost? And what did I have? Right? And in this place, there's often those feelings of sadness and anger and guilt and despair and fear. And then the other side, and sometimes there's also joy and connection and gratitude for what you had. And then we have the restoration. What is my life going to be like now? How am I going to get my needs met? What does moving forward look like? Right? And this is sometimes very sad and heartbreaking. And there's times when it's very sort of joyful, depending on the moment. And what happens is we sort of expect grief to be this linear process where first you start out really sad and you just get exponentially less sad over time. And that's not how it happens. People go back and forth between their loss and what did I lose? And oh, what comes next? And what did I lose? And what comes next? And neither of those is a step backward. Neither of those is a sign that you're stuck in your grief or you're moving on too quickly and not grieving enough. And so I want you to recognize or invite you to recognize that you will, around major events, oscillate very quickly. 100 times in a day, you could go back and forth, right? Where you're sort of going along okay, then you have a wave of grief. And then you have a period of time where your grief doesn't seem so close and you're just focused on doing and all these other things in your life and the rest of things that are going to happen. And then you go back to a wave of grief. And to recognize that this is your body's way, your mind's way, your soul's way of trying to make sense of something that's too painful to face head on. And it's not a sign that you're doing something wrong. You're not supposed to be only in one side or another. It's not supposed to be one and then the other. But what you want is a little bit of grief and a little bit of sort of restoration, figuring out what comes next, and trusting that your system will go back and forth as you need. Around anniversaries and holidays and major events, you may have more oscillation. But mostly I want to normalize avoidance. It is okay if you feel sadness all the time. And it is okay if you don't feel sadness all the time, right? It is okay if you can go long periods of time without thinking about it, right? If you're worried about how you're coping, you can certainly always speak with a therapist and get some guidance and advice. Generally speaking, if you feel like there's good meaning in your life and you are able to connect to the people around you, and you are able to sort of engage in your life, even with the presence of such painful grief, your avoidance may be pretty functional, but you can always talk to a specialist about that. But the dual process model basically helps us track inside, like, wow, I'm overwhelmed by my grief. And in this moment, my sense of loss is so consuming, it feels like that's all there is. And then other times the grief seems so far away and I feel guilty for the grief being so far away. Or I feel like there's something wrong with me that grief feels so far away. And what I want you to do is whichever place you are in, just be gentle with yourself and let yourself go back and forth. The other paradigm that I want to discuss is the window of tolerance. As I said, we bring this from trauma theory. And because so much of caregiving, you are in survival mode. I know every single one of you who's a caregiver knows exactly what I'm talking about, right? Where you're always waiting for that phone call to ring. You're always listening with one ear out. When you are in survival mode, you can't be present, right? When you are facing down a lion, you're not taking in the beauty of the mountains, right? You have tunnel vision, you're facing down the lion and figure out, how do I keep myself safe in this moment? You're not taking everything and you're not noticing, how do I feel about the lion? You're just dealing with a problem in front of you, right? And so the window of tolerance is a way to track internal to you, where am I? So we all have a window of tolerance. It's an imaginary, it's a hypothetical window, don't look for it. And the window of tolerance is the space in which we can tolerate everything that's happening and stay totally present. And if you have repeated stress and traumas, that window is going to be quite narrow, right? Because your resources are just draining you. And in that window, you can handle what's happening and be present and feel your feelings and think your thoughts all at the same time, even if it's painful. And there are 2 ways we move out of what we can tolerate. One is we go up into hyperarousal, and that's when we're spinning out in our heads. That's when we go spinning around in circles and we're anxious and we're in our heads and we're trying to fix things and nothing's working and we're just talking and moving and fixing and doing and researching, what about this and what about this and what about this? And the thing with hyperarousal is it's a really good way to get a lot of stuff done. And when you are a caregiver, you have to stay in hyperarousal for long periods of time, or else you're not going to get stuff done. And the hard part is letting yourself come back down. And so one of the reasons I like to name this is to recognize that it is okay to go into hyperarousal. You may end up sort of irritable, you may be sort of disconnected, but usually when I describe hyperarousal, people sort of know that energy, right? Where they're just talking and nothing's really sinking in and they're just going around in circles in their head. That it is okay to go into hyperarousal, and it becomes problematic when you can't get out of hyperarousal. And the hard part with caregiving is it encourages you to stay in hyperarousal for months and years, right? Even afterwards. The other way that we go out of our window of tolerance is we drop down into hypoarousal. And that's when we're numb and we're dissociated. That's where we come home at the end of the day and we watch TV and we have no idea what we're even watching, but we can't take anything in. When we look inside and we can't feel anything, right? When we might want to drink so we don't have to feel quite so much, where we're going through the motions, where it feels like there's a mask facing the world and that's going through the motions, where everything looks okay on the outside. And on the inside, there's so much more pain that you can't even put your finger on, right? And that can vary. It could be a little numb all the way to like this total dissociation. And again, hypoarousal in small doses is expected and normal, and we can't feel all of our feelings all the time. We would get nothing done, right? We have to separate ourselves from our feelings. And I think for both the window of tolerance and the dual process model, what we look for is flexibility. Can I go into hyperarousal when I need to? When I need to face down the lion, can I rally all my resources and just have this tunnel vision, face down the lion? But then can I let my nervous system recognize when the lion is gone and I need to be present again and let my feelings come, right? If I need to check out just because I'm so overwhelmed I cannot take anything else in, can I let that happen? But then can I also bring myself back? Right? And so one of the, so as again, I'm going to say this, I know I've repeated this, the window of tolerance I think is so helpful for caregivers, because the healthcare system, the more you are in hyperarousal, the more you will get done, the more praise you will get, the more accomplished you will feel. And for many people, the hyperarousal becomes a form of love. This is you giving everything you have and fighting and changing and advocating and all the things you have to do to be able to take care of somebody who is sick. And so I want to recognize, again, there's nothing wrong with being in hyperarousal, but when you recognize that you're having trouble coming out of it, right, that is a good time to get some additional support and get some additional help. If you, in all of your free time, if you Google grounding exercises, there's like 1,000 of them. You sort of have to figure out which ones work for you. You're going to try 10 of them and they won't work, and the 11th one will. Grounding exercises do not get rid of all of your anxiety like a drug. What it does is it takes you from like a 10 to a 7. And once you're at a 7, right, hopefully these are made up numbers. Hopefully when you're at a 7, then you can sort of get a grip on things, and then you can go for a walk, and then you can meditate, you can go get a hug, you can take a nap, you can do the things you want to do. But the grounding exercises are what bring you up out of hypoarousal, or down out of hyperarousal. And you really just have to trial and error those. They tend to feel a little silly when you're doing them, but they really work. They teach the Navy SEALs ratio breaths to calm their heart rate when they're trying to go on missions. And so I think if it works for Navy SEALs, it will work for all of you as well. The first time I learned about that, I thought somebody said baby SEALs do that, and I was really excited, but it was Navy SEALs. So my next question that I want you to ask yourself, when did my grief start? And you can notice, you can check in with your window of tolerance. What comes up when you ask this question? Do you start spinning out in your head? Do you check out inside? Do you all of a sudden focus on something else that's not in the room, right? We're checking out a little bit. And asking yourself, when did my grief start, means having to acknowledge the enormity of what you're going through. And a lot of times coping means not acknowledging the enormity of what you're going through, because if you acknowledge that all the time, you would get, you wouldn't get out of bed, you would get nothing done. And so it's okay to compartmentalize a little bit, but really ask yourself, when did my grief start? Was it when I noticed that odd symptom, him forgetting this, her behaving oddly, right? Was that when something went off my head saying something's wrong? And I'm not sure what it is, but something's off and I know it's off, right? Was it when I got the diagnosis and I understood what it meant? Was it when the person no longer recognized me? Was it when they died? Right? When did my grief start is an acknowledgement of what you've been through and what you're going through and what you've been carrying and for how long you've been carrying it. Right? It's just a really good question to ask yourself. So this part, as I want to go into some typical losses that you might experience with CJD, and we're going to keep going with those. Everybody who is a caregiver for somebody with a neurodegenerative disease will have some overlapping losses. There's losses that you have across the board. So some of these are general for neurodegenerative disease, but most of these are specific to CJD and the rapidity of the decline and the uniqueness of the experience, right? For instance, some of the losses that you have are roles and other milestones. And that is both for the caregivers and family members whose lives are sort of in the suspended animation of trying to figure this out and what's going on. For the roles and milestones you thought you were going to have together, and for that person as well, right? So while everyone else in your life is doing whatever they are doing at your age, right? Whether you are in your 20s and everyone else is finding a partner, or you are in your 30s and 40s and other people are having and raising families, or you are in your 60s and 70s and 80s and enjoying your grandchildren, whatever you are doing in your life, one of those things got impacted by the experience of CJD, right? Again, whether you are the person with the disease, whether you are a family member or caregiver, whether you are in bereavement. One of the other losses of CJD that is tricky is the life cycle. It's often out of life cycle. It happens to folks who are younger than you would expect it, ages before the expected life expectancy for many people. And so a lot of times the people around you are not going through what you were going through and have not been through what you were going through, right? And that makes it a little more lonely, right? And a little harder to do. The loss of the person as you knew them before is true for all neurodegenerative diseases, but with CJD, it happens usually before you even know what it is that you're dealing with. And that is where it is unique, right? That you sort of lose the person as you knew them, one of those ambiguous losses, before you can even put a name on why this is happening, before you know if you're going to get them back. Right? Some of the other losses, and this is something that Debbie and I had spoken about at the beginning, is that when you have to take on the role of expert, when you have to educate people in healthcare about what the condition is, what the disease is, you lose the ability to be taken care of. You lose the ability to be fallible, to have an off day, right? When you have to take on the role of expert, however much pride and how much that is the right thing to do, because you have to be the expert. Sometimes you have to advocate. That comes with a loss of the ability to be the recipient and to trust that somebody else knows what they're doing and will do so without you having to be in hyperarousal and overfunction. A lot of the losses with CJD, control of your life, control of your weekend, your schedule, your days, predictability. Do I know what my life is going to be like next week? Security and connection. A lot of times, some of the losses are with your existing connections, right? When you have family and friends, and I define family as anybody who's in your life who loves you and goes through life with you, right? Whatever family means to you. That your existing family and friends either don't understand, and so there becomes a distance where there used to be space. Becomes a space where there used to be closeness, right? And there's a grief in that however well-meaning they are, if they can't understand what you went through, sometimes there can be space in that. Or they can get fatigued, and you recognize that you are so at your wit's end and you need so much help and support, understandably, and you try to spread it around perhaps to different people or try to hold it inside. But a lot of times these connections get fatigued, right? They have there are other things happening in their lives, and there's some grief in that as well. There's a lot of times these experiences change your relationship to higher powers, your sense of a faith in healthcare, income, career, depending on where you are in your life and where the person is. And because there's so much caregiving so quickly, you lose the time to grieve the losses and to recognize what it is that's happening and what it is that you've been through. And so the next question I want you to ask yourself is take a moment and ask yourself, where do I hold my grief in my body? If I were to take a moment and just scan my body from head to toe, where would I find my grief? Where does my body hold it, right? Because our nervous systems hold our grief. For a lot of people, it could be tightness in the chest, it could be back pain, right? It could be heaviness in the limbs. There's lots of different places, a pit in the stomach. But ask yourself, where do I hold my grief in my body? And when you feel that grief coming up, can I take a moment and breathe into that? Not to get rid of it, but just to acknowledge it and to breathe into it and to give it some space and give it some air, give it some love, give it some support. And just sort of have a moment to honor what your body holds, right? And this is true if somebody died yesterday or if they died 30 years ago. The grief, you're still holding on to the grief. So some of the struggles of when you have grief that's specific to CJD, right? And this is the first one is one of my favorite reasons why this group exists, right? One of the struggles is finding others who get it, where you don't have to explain so much. right? You can just say a little bit and you know that the other person gets it. And that's so important. It's so important to find these kinds of communities. Another struggle of CJD grief is the trauma of diagnosis, how long it takes to get a diagnosis, the certainty of mortality when you get the diagnosis, how far progressed the person is by the time you get it, right? There's a lot that goes into the trauma of that diagnostic process. Watching a person become unrecognizable so quickly. The next one, I know I'm going through these sort of quickly. I'm going to leave these slides with Debbie to hand out because I want us to have more time for conversations. The next one is coming out of survival mode. And we talked about when you're in hyperarousal, when you have been a caregiver and you've been fighting and advocating and dealing with a new normal and a new loss every single day, there's something new and something new. And what did I lose and what's happening? What needs to happen now? Who do I need to rally? What needs to change? It is hard to come out of that mode. One, because our nervous systems sort of lend themselves to continuing to be in this kind of mode. And one is that, again, as I said before, for many people, caregiving is the last act of love. And so the hyperarousal gets sort of conflated with love. And this idea of coming down can sometimes feel like an abandonment, falsely feel like an abandonment, right? Because we sort of conflate them. Another struggle of CJD grief is that there are so many ambiguous losses. There are so many things that get lost that are not named in little bits and pieces, like we talked about 2 screens back. And figuring out, when do you have the bandwidth to stop and recognize and grieve what it is that you've lost and what it is that you've been through and what you're holding? Because there's so much that happens so quickly. The grief of changed relationships, as we discussed, you have much less to invest in the relationships. And a lot of times you may find yourself connecting more with people in a community like this or somebody who's been through something at least somewhat similar. Right? The missed milestones, which we discussed. And I think one of the things that I think is really common that I've seen in my practice for something like this or something like a glioblastoma, which has sort of a similar trajectory of by the time you're diagnosed, the person is pretty far gone and you have about a year, that same sort of trajectory, is that you lose the opportunity when you recognize that that person is dying to have closure, to say, hey, I'm sorry, I love you, I forgive you, I'm grateful for you, all the things that we want to be able to say. We lose the ability to do that because we're so focused rightfully on diagnosis and stabilization and getting people safe and figuring out what's happening, that by the time we have the opportunity to have that conversation, we cannot. And the ability to, how do we sit within our grief, that liminal space that didn't get to be acknowledged, right? All the things left unsaid. Ira Byock has a great book called like The 4 Most Important Things. I'm butchering the title, but if you Google it, it'll be something similar like that, which talks about the things that you need to sort of hear in every relationship. For that sense of, I'm using closure in air quotes, I don't know if closure exists, but for that sense of security. And I know when I read it, when I was thinking, I had a beloved family member who died of a neurodegenerative disease. And I know when I was reading that book, I felt more comforted recognizing that even if I didn't have that conversation before she died, there were those things that felt so present in the relationship that I still got to reflect on that security because I knew that we had the kind of relationship where those things were given. I will try to find the actual name and I will send it to Debbie later. But if you Google Ira Byock, the 4 things that matter most, I'm almost positive that's most of the words of the book title. So this is one of my favorite questions, especially for people who are caregivers, either by experience or by their nature. And I want you to ask yourself, if you are used to being the person who does everything at your own expense, and I imagine a lot of people, I can't see you all, are nodding right now in your heads. I want you to ask yourself, what can I do less of in this moment? In my grief and in my caregiving, what can I do less of? Can I do less for others? Can I do less saying yes when I want to say no? Can I do less berating and criticizing myself for things and judging myself and holding myself to unrealistic standards? Can I do less of expectations of who I'm supposed to be? What can I do less of? Can I do less of clenching my jaw in this moment? And so asking yourself, I hope that you ask yourself this all the time, especially folks who are socialized as women who are taught to be caretakers and that your needs matter less than other people's. What can I do less of in this moment? What can I release myself from doing? And there are some things you cannot do less of. But ask yourself, is there something, all the things that are happening, all the things I'm doing to myself emotionally, psychologically, socially, do those also need to happen? What can I do less of in my grief, right? And it's a good way to sort of stop and check in with yourself about the things that you're carrying. And so this is sort of the last slide. This is my I don't know if these are sort of like cheesy things you would normally paint on a sign on a wall. But these are things I often find myself saying to patients and saying to family members. And so I wanted to put them here. Some of the many things. Number one is name what you've lost, right? We talked about all the different kind of losses. Name it. Say it out loud. Say it out loud to yourself. Say it out loud to somebody else. Name what you've lost and hold it lovingly. It doesn't mean you have to accept it. It doesn't mean you have to feel okay about the universe taking this from you, but recognize that you can hold this pain in a loving way within yourself. Not to get rid of the pain, but just to make sure it doesn't burn when it's inside. Be kind to yourself about how you are coping. I would say 90% of my job is convincing people they're not crazy for however they're grieving, right? I would like to be out of business for this part of my work. So be kind to yourself for however you're coping. If you're not hurting somebody else and you're not hurting yourself, you're okay. And if you're coping by cleaning every single day, if you're coping by not seeing anybody, if you're coping by seeing everybody, if you're coping by feeling all the things, if you're coping by feeling none of the things, if you're going back and forth, if you're coping and you're so exhausted that all you can do is watch reruns on TV for 8 hours a day so that you can spend 45 minutes a day talking to other people, be kind to yourself. There are lots of different ways that people figure out how to make sense of this world, and you are exhausted. If you're worried about how you're coping, speak with a professional, but please be kind to yourself. Number 3 is going to be kind to others who may not show up how you need them. You will have a hole in your heart from what you went through, and other people will not be able to fill this. And that will make you very angry. And other people will not know what to say or do, and they will be awkward, and they will say stupid things to you. And this will happen. Well-intentioned, but stupid things to you. Be kind to them. I'm not saying forgive them. I'm not saying whatever, but recognize that other people being awkward and not knowing what to say is not a sign of whether they love you, is that this is an awkward situation. Be kind to people who cope differently than you do. In your family, some people want to face the grief head on, and some people want to focus on what comes next. And some people want to talk about it all the time, and some people want to not talk about it at all. And some people are going to be angry, and some people will be sad, and some people will talk about memories, and some people will never mention it again, all in the same family, right? Be kind to people who cope differently than you. It is not a threat to your grief. And look for opportunities for imperfect connections. Every connection is going to be bittersweet and painful because there's a hole in your heart. And so waiting for a connection that feels totally good is going to leave you spending more time alone. And so look for opportunities for imperfect connections. If it's actively harmful for you, don't keep toxic people around, but look for opportunities to take in as much connections as you can. Number 4, recognize that while nothing will fill the hole, you can create a life worth living, even if it's not how you expected it to be. And a lot of times the fact that I read this on an Instagram, like a social media thing about grief, that sometimes one of the hardest parts about grief is realizing that there's a life worth living that you didn't expect it to be. And that just really, really resonated. That there can be room for both the whole and this rich and meaningful life, that they can both exist, right? Number 5, for whatever, the next one, this is actually got from AA, their literature. Don't compare your insides to other people's outsides. Well, this person moved on quickly, and this person's doing this, and this person's doing that, and this person's never crying, and this person did their hair every day, and this person showered in the last week, whatever it is. Don't compare your insides to other people's outsides. Whatever's happening for you is your journey and what you have been through. And it's real, and it's reasonable, and it's what you went through, and it's worth honoring and acknowledging. What people look like on the outside is what they need other people to see. Don't hold yourself to timelines and expectations for where you think you should be. This is air quotes for anybody who's not looking, should in air quotes. There's no timeline for grief. There's nowhere you should be at 6 months or a year or 2 years or 5 years. There's just where you need to be, doing the best you can wherever you are. Okay? This is true for as long as you are reasonably healthy. You're taking care of yourself, you're eating, you're showering, you're okay. If you are concerned about your ability to take care of yourself, if there are safety concerns, then we want to get interventions, right? Let yourself have your feelings without the pressure of action or being over it. Be where you are, not where you think you should be, right? My last one. And ask yourself, and this is a great self-care one, in my hardest moments, whatever that means to you, what do I most need to hear, know, and remember? And this might be something you literally write down in a Post-it note and keep near you, or you ask your best friend to tell you, or whoever's around you. in my hardest moments, what do I most need to hear, know, and remember? Because we have moments when we are totally on top of things. And in those moments, we can access our wisdom. We say, oh, wait, I know that I did the best I could. I know that our love endured. I know that this, whatever your perspective is. And I want you to be able to tell yourself that in those moments when things are hard and you are depleted and everything feels scary and alone. So in my hardest moments, what do I most need to hear, know, and remember? I also added my contact information. I'm in New York. I think most of you are not. But if you have other questions or concerns, you can certainly always reach out, and Debbie will have this as well.